Hi all, I have another absolutely fascinating stockfish versus anti-fish game to show you. This was on a very fast time limit, 5 minutes with a 2-second increment. Often these are really entertaining games at the faster time limits, and I thought this was superb. So let's have a look at what happened. So this was in the Chess.com at 7th edition Blitz Bonanza final. So e4 from stockfish, we have e5. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, so classic Ruy Lopez territory. Knight f6, end of the book, so the Berlin defense. We have d3, bishop c5, and now stockfish takes on c6. This has been popularized by Magnus Carlsen in recent years. D takes c6, white castles, bishop g4, h3, bishop h5, g4, and now guess what anti-fish plays in this position? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video. Okay. Knight takes g4. Anti-fish seems to have an acute awareness of its opponents, often that they are castling, and anti-fish hasn't committed the king. And sometimes it can castle queenside or do stuff with the king. And this seems to be underestimated, not just by stockfish, but by other opponents of anti-fish as well. So in this game, after bishop takes g4, how good is this pin? How can pressure be brought to bear? What is the story here? We have bishop e3. And the really curious computer-looking move, and when I say computer-looking, I mean in the classic alpha beta tradition of weird-looking computer moves. Anti-fish plays bishop b4. There has been a high-level grandmaster game in this position with bishop d6. This occurred, believe it or not, in a game of Peter Lecco against David Navarra in Linares, of all tournaments, one of the most famous tournaments going in 2018. And in that game with bishop d6, which seems pretty sensible, black played for a quick f5. So Navarra playing a very enterprising game with the knight sack. And later they actually, this exchange sack, and it was quite an entertaining game in its own right. But it eventually got a situation where there was a perpetual check coming up. Actually, no, not quite a perpetual check. Let me just show you. So, white, the exchange down, but black giving back the exchange. No, not a perpetual check. Just an equal rook and pawn ending. It petered out. So that's a very important stem game in this whole variation with bishop d6. But we have this weird-looking move from anti-fish, bishop b4. Is it really thinking that a3 or c3 worsens white's position in some way? Maybe that's the case. Maybe that really is the case. Stockfish chose a3. On c3, if c3 is played, I guess you could argue that d3 is slightly compromised. The d file is less solid. So if black perhaps retreated the bishop, maybe even to e7 is possible, and then queen d6 and castling queenside, d3 could be more of a target, slightly loosened by c3. So maybe there's a case that a3 is more solid. Stockfish seemed to believe so anyway, and gained the tempo that way. And the bishop went to e7. Now this does have an interesting perk to it, rather than bishop d6 we saw in the Grandmaster stem game. I believe that interesting perk is actually the bishop can go here to support e5, and also add more strength to supporting, controlling d4. So it's a lockdown on d4 more than bishop d6 in a way. So we have king g2, f5, queen e1 unpinning. And this is just really interesting stuff. Bishop takes f3, king takes, and now f4. So it seems the king is not really the main subject of interest here after g5. It seems actually anti-fish almost understands another super high level concept somehow, that the act of blockading the opponent's passed pawns takes away resources from your position and counterplay. And we're going to see white is struggling here to contain these passed pawns. We see bishop f6, and you see that aforementioned lockdown on the d4 square here. So that's a really interesting idea compared to the Grandmaster game, the bishop coming here rather than on d6 to control d4. And this part of the lockdown combines with this kingside lockdown, because white now has to battle with these very dangerous passed pawns. So Nimzovich indicated that passed pawns are like criminals, they have to be kept under lock and key. But to do that, you need resources of a prison, you need prison guards. It takes up a lot of resources to have that blockade set up. And we see here after rook h1, queen e7, f3, we see g3, and white is now having to battle all the time to keep these passed pawns, these criminals, under lock and key. Otherwise, once they become very, more advanced, they're going to be deadly. So we have queen f1, and black castles queenside. Look at that lockdown on the d4 square here. It's an absolutely superb central lockdown, combined with absolutely superb potential of these pawns. So for the piece, it seems anti-fish has got quite a bit going for it now. We have check, rook ag1, rook g5. Things get a bit strange now on this other side of the board. The king fleeing to the queen side, c5, yes, even more lockdown on d4. So white's really tied up. And to be honest, it reminds me of a rapid game I had with Grandmaster Pert. Nicholas Pert, he had us, passed pawns, protected passed pawns. I couldn't do anything. I was just a spectator for the rest of the game. It seems like Stockfish might be such a spectator. Let's see what happens on this part of the board. a6, rook h6, queen d6, h4, knight c4. Okay, the queen moves to f8. And now stretching out on this side of the board, b5. The knight goes here. Queen d6, the rook goes back, rook d8. Yeah, white really can't do much. These criminals are taking up a lot of resources to keep the blockade going, basically. So we have king h8, bishop a5, and this gets to be a strange episode of the game, actually. After knight c1, we see it seems Stockfish doesn't mind. Perhaps from a calculation perspective, the bishop kind of locked out of the game here with this move. Maybe it's a blitz game, and maybe it didn't think that deeply enough about this bishop. But it seems from a visual perspective, this is another big no-no. But it does seem to pass the immediate kind of calculation tests, as though this bishop on a5 is okay. But it's looking a bit weird, isn't it? Because it's another kind of commitment of resources to make sure the bishop is not going to be trapped. So we have another subtle commitment over here of resources to make sure these pawns are kept under lock and key. But this bishop is also now having to be safeguarded tactically. So we see knight b3, rook b8, and now this. So the knight's safeguarding the bishop, queen h3, king b7. The black's rooks don't really even have to be behind these passed pawns. It's only the bishop that needs to be. King c1. We see rook g7. But it does seem a bit of torture going on here in a way. Queen f8, queen e6. The queen makes an exciting entrance into black's position here and has to be carefully evicted. Rook h7, giving the subtle nudge that maybe h3 at some point is going to be dangerous. Rook d2, rook h6, yes. So indirectly it's going to be discovering an attack on the queen perhaps. The queen stumbles back. Bishop e7, queen d7, another insertion into the position. Bishop d6, rook d1. We see now queen e7 offering the exchange of queens. This is rejected. Bishop c5. That bishop is just there, just pretty fixed on a5 at the moment. Queen g2, and we have this bishop going inside the position. Yeah, if black had, of course, taken on c5, it does seem as though that's going to be the end of the bishop after queen takes. So it wasn't anyway. So check, though, that's a nasty place for that bishop now on e3. King a8, rook h3, and now c5. So black is also releasing the kind of responsibility of locking out this bishop. It's only this pawn that's needed now in a way to hold down this bishop, protecting that pawn. And this rook is now freer to do something else, something more prestigious perhaps. Rook e h1, king a7, king a2, and this rook switches over here. So both rooks are kind of acknowledging the bishop played an important role defending h4 and decide both to defend h4 just in case for the moment. And now we have this rook 6 at h7, c4. This does seem to compromise the d3 pawn. So it's almost a little bit, what is the panic to do this? But anyway, it was decided on c4, rook h6, king c2. Now, I guess one of the ideas of playing like this is that white, in theory, could use the a file in some variations. So by playing this c4 and king c2, it seems as though d3 is also safeguarded enough. Or is it? We see rook d6, queen f1, rook h7, queen g2, king b7, and now after rook e1, king b8, queen h1. Here, if rook takes e3, this isn't quite enough, the exchange sack here, after rook c6, and this position, there's a big idea coming up here. After queen d7, I wonder if you can spot it. If I give you 5 seconds here, what would you play with black in this variation? Okay, the criminal's not been kept under lock and key here because of queen takes and then g2, and they're crashing through. So queen h1 was played, not the exchange sack, which you might think is tempting, but bear that in mind for later. King a7, rook e2, queen g7, knight c1, rook g6, rook g2, officially blockading that g pawn, queen e7, knight b3, rook h8, rook e2, queen d7, we have rook g2, queen e7, rook e2, queen d7, and it looks as though, hold on, is this game actually going anywhere? Queen g7, queen g2, rook d6. Now, all of a sudden, there is a concrete idea emerging in this position. It's here that Stockfish, perhaps in time pressure as well, did play the exchange sack, rook takes e3. So the question has to be asked, why now? Why here? Well, if rook e1, it turns out, it seems, after queen d7, rook d1, this position is getting dangerous. For example, g2 here, and then this, and a quick infiltration for rook g1 is going to be crushing. For example, or g2, rook g2, and then rook g1. Yeah, to sort of win the queen, at least. Yeah, it's crashing through there. So that was on rook e1. And just to show another sideline on this, if rook e h1, then there's rook takes d3, and then taking here, and then rook d1 threatens queen d3 checkmate, as an example, g2, and this is just crushing. So in this line as well, let's have a quick look at on rook d1. There's also another way of playing it. So I think we've just seen that. No, pardon me. On queen h1 as another example, rook d7. This way of playing it is interesting as well. Something interesting turns up here. If white's not doing much, rook takes d3 turns up as a major tactical liability, basically. For example, king takes and then check, and then rook d2 wins that queen. And this is really good because winning that rook as well. So that's some of the dangers expressed basically by this variation, which I felt I needed to show you. And here, if knight takes, then queen takes c4 check. This crashes through for black. And that's just going to be horrible for white there. So it seems anyway, the evidence was stacked up that this was somehow needed to do this exchange sacrifice. F takes, knight takes c5. But we have rook f6 now, and now knight a4. You might think, well, why knight a4? If b3, as another example, queen g4 is a big threat here. So f takes check, and actually it's very important here to crash through with containment activated, turned on, and containment. The choice of pawn is very important from a containment perspective to contain the rook. Taking with this pawn shuts that rook out from rook f3, and this secures the win, no problem. But if you don't do it with containment activated, if you do this rook f2 and you take like this, if you take the other way, with g takes f2, then it turns out rook f3 and e2, although the pawns might be queening, there's a perpetual check in spectacular fashion, like this, where the king can't actually escape the perpetual checks. Here, if king g8, rook g7 is actually checkmate, so black wouldn't be escaping the perpetual checks there at all. But yes, with that method, taken with the right pawn, it wins. So so that's on b3 here. So anyway, knight a4 was played, and we have queen d7. And that not only hits the knight, it also carries this idea of queen g4 here, which is really quite crushing. Yeah, it's too much to bear, these protected passed pawns now. On queen g4 immediately, by the way, this is not working after taking check. And say this bishop b6 check is saving the day, because there's always bishop takes f2, and I don't think it matters which way that's taken, yeah, because the bishop b6 taking on f2 will save the day for white. So we see queen d7, not queen g4. So queen d7, so hitting that knight. And now after knight c5, so there isn't support for bishop b6 check to do something about these passed pawns. It's now queen g4 is played with much greater effect. We have rook h1. So on f takes here, this check is a real killer after taking. There's nothing really white can do. The pawns are landing. So rook h1, rook takes f3, black is crashing through here. And this is just pure desperation, capitulation from Stockfish in spectacular style. Just giving up the bishop, then giving up the knight. Well, sorry, it's not. It can't be taken out because of the rook, but it's about to be given up with king b3 to avoid rook f2 check. So lesser evil decisions, a string of lesser evil decisions, giving up the knight, and then these pawns are just crashing through. White's last throw of the dice is these checks, which just serve to prolong the game, really. So the game ending pretty soon. Yes, black's definitely got enough material to checkmate. So I thought this is a very curious, interesting game, anti-Stockfish, but probably anti-classical AB engine generally. It seems a very difficult to understand piece sacrifice. Even the Grandmaster Stem game didn't have this depth of vision to just tie up the opponent's resources so much on the king side. Also play on the queen side. It was a total lockdown of the position, tying white up in knots basically. Stockfish perhaps didn't seem to help that much, having a bishop stranded on a5, adding to the comedic aspects to the game. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this game as much as me. If you did, please click on the top left box, which should appear shortly. Become a member at chessworld.net, play against other YouTubers. You can also test yourself on variations covered in this game on the improved menu at Chess World, the puzzle books option, which has a link also to the annotated game. And I'll bolt on a bit from the puzzle book shortly after this video. Comments, questions, donations, see the description. Like, share, subscribe with the notification bell. Really appreciate it. Thanks very much. This is the celebration puzzle book of that game. So at chessworld.net, if you go to improved puzzle books, you'll see this game Stockfish, Anti-Fish. And let's have a go at this. So clear advantage ticked. And let's also tick mates as well. So our first example here, black to play in this variation. This would be a very silly move from white because of f4 trapping that bishop. Here, black to play for a clear advantage. What's the move here? I think it looks as though I've completely forgotten. Is it bishop takes a1 and then we can take on d3? Yes. Black to play for a clear advantage here. I think this is crashing down with rook g1. So that's going to be crushing. And there's another move to carry on apparently. Not sure. What's the hint? Bishop d4. Okay. Black to play for a clear advantage here. Is it rook? No, I'm not sure actually. Hint, queen d6. Okay. Just putting pressure on d3 there. Here in this variation, not sure. I'm going to go for a hint. Queen d7. All right. So surely we can just take on d3. And here it's important to keep the rook contained, not to allow rook f3. So this one, keeping the rook contained, and now g2. Simple and strong. This one, black to play for a clear advantage here. We can surely just play rook f2 check here, and this one, and then just queen. Okay, yeah, hope you enjoyed the puzzle books as well. Note also that there's new famous player puzzle books to check out. I've added Garry Kasparov just recently, and this also has the age indicator of when Kasparov played all these amazing game finishes. So check that out as well on the improved menu puzzle books. Okay, thanks so much.